Hello everyone, this is Chris Schmidt from Rocket Lasso, and I have another tutorial here. This tutorial is going to be covering a technique that I think is very open-ended. There's a lot of potential here, a lot of variation, a lot of crazy places this one can go. In fact, I'm going to split it up into two parts. The first one's going to tackle the base part of the technique, and that's pretty much all you need. And then the second part's going to be just exploring and seeing some more weird combinations that we might be able to make some fun things out of. If you end up making anything fun out of this, if you use it professionally, just make something cool, make a daily render, whatever, please tag me on it at Rocket Lasso on Twitter, Instagram, all the different things. I'd love to see what your end result is. But there's a lot to cover, so let's dive right on into Cinema. Here we are inside of Cinema 4D S22. I got a couple things prepped here. A sky with an HDR applied to it, a gold material. Here's a Mo text with a font changed. It's a beefier font here. When I don't know what to create specifically, using some sort of letter or number is a good go-to. And the font, the skinny fonts tend not to work too well inside of volumes and whatnot. So I want a single character. We're going to keep it simple. This technique should be applicable to almost any shape, any model, tons of different applications. But a lot of studios, a lot of people are going to need to be working from text. So that's why we're beginning with this. And when I'm not sure what to use, I usually just use an ampersand because I just like the shape of it. Okay, good start there. We'll use an ampersand, and I want to create a volume from it. So begin with a volume builder and a volume mesher. Drop the Mo text into the builder, drop the builder into the mesher, and we should get a blobby text. Hit NB, and you can see the poly count. It's quite low right now, which is why it looks so chunky. What's great about using the volume builder mesher, well, just the volume workflow in general, is that we get all quads, and not only are they all quads, but they're very evenly scaled. So we need more. We want more detail. So let's work from what our final mesh will be. And we can drop this pretty low, I think. I'm going to drop it, not 1. That's too much, but maybe 2. 2 seems like a pretty good distribution of points here. Maybe we'll push it further. I'm not sure. And I'm going to round it out. It doesn't have to get rounded out. In fact, any shape we want to feed in. And it doesn't even have to be a volume mesher. It's just a good way of getting an even poly count. But I want to smooth this out. So inside the volume, create a SDF smooth. It's going to smooth everything out quite a bit. Actually, I don't mind the way that final looks. Maybe I'll pull it back a little bit. Something maybe like that. Yeah, that's nice and rounded, takes those corners off. And I'm going to like this effect a little bit more because it's going to be able to, the technique will flow around the sides a little bit more smoothly. So this will actually be our final geometry. So this is the one that we're going to deform. But let's copy and paste this and make a second one. And this will actually be our dynamic one. So I'm going to type in the word dynamic, and this is going to be seen by the collisions of all of our different dynamics, spline dynamics specifically in this tutorial. There's a trick to this though. First, let's drag our gold material onto the deforming mesher so we can distinguish between the two. And a problem that we're going to see is as we decrease our polygon size, or rather, let's make it bigger, and that is by increasing our voxel size. I can jump this up to 4, I can jump it up to 5. And what's going to happen is it's going to get really hard to see, but you can see if I turn off that mesh that it's kind of destroying it to a large degree. And the reason why it's getting so destroyed is the smoothing. The smoothing is very dependent on our voxel size. So I'm going to be pulling way back on this strength and trying to get it back to this rounded shape. It's a little bit hard to see both, but I just like, if we find the right amount here, it should just kind of intersect a little bit, and we should see about the exact same amount. It doesn't have to be identical. The closer they are, the better, but the lower poly that this is, also the better. In addition to that, I think that we have a lot of leeway this time to actually crank up in our mesher the adaptive. And what that's going to do is start removing polygons that we don't need and make it even lower polygon. You can see, or even lower poly count. This becomes very, very, very low poly. Now we got to find a happy medium because a shape like that actually could create a little bit of trouble for us. So let's make sure that we get these edges maintained a little bit, but I don't think we have to go too overboard. Something like that is pretty good. Yeah, I'm quite pleased with that. And if we're dropping it down that far, potentially your voxel size can be, actually, it seems to be maintaining that shape. Nope, it just took a second to refresh. We can increase this, and you see it's going to make that a little bit cleaner as well. So just find your right balance there. It does introduce a lot of triangles. I don't think that makes a big deal, but this lower poly mesh is going to be very helpful. In fact, this is going to be pretty much hidden from here on out. and we can look at our original one. Let's just make sure actually that it is still matching. It is matching pretty dang well. Once again, we could grab the smooth and just tweak that on the edges a little bit if we were inclined to. I think that's probably pretty good. You can see how many polygons we have here. We would not want to run dynamics on that, but running dynamics on this lower poly version, that seems a lot more reasonable. So here is the thought. We're going to be running dynamic splines on the surface of whatever shape that we have, in this case, this letter. There's a lot of different ways to generate those splines. We could just draw a bunch of splines. We could clone a bunch of splines. We can even make it semi-parametric by making a cloner and feeding it, say, like a helix. My plan this time, though, which let's see if this works well for us, is let's create our splines via hair. Simulate hair objects, add hair, and we're going to get a whole bunch of hairs generated. We have a lot of control here directly over how many we have. Currently, it's creating one for every polygon vertex. I'm going to change that to polygon area. So now we can put any counts that we want inside here. We're going to keep this pretty light in the beginning. Let's say 55, not that many. The length is fine, 100. I'm going to set the segments to 10. A good ratio right now is I'm going to do 1/10 of the amount. In addition to that, we could click regrow, which is going to regrow the count. Whenever we change this count, especially if we increase it, it's a good idea to click regrow. Right now, it's not making a difference, but we definitely will be doing that in the future. Currently, this is preparing for a hair material to get applied, but we don't need that. What we want to do is say, this is not going to generate render hairs. Turn that off. It is going to generate splines. So this is now a singular spline object. But you see, boom, tons of different splines all over the place. And that's because our hairs are actually what's going to be generated. And currently the hairs are creating 50,000. That's not what we want. So we click on hairs, go to root, set that to as guides. And now there's exactly as many hairs as there are guides. Next up, go under dynamic and turn it off. We don't want this affected by these hair dynamics at all. We will actually be driving this with regular cinema softbody dynamics, and that is actually the step that we're at. I don't believe that we need this hair material. So on hair, right click, simulation, softbody. These should now be softbody, and if I click off of it, we can see these individual splines. I can maybe make it a little more visible in the viewport by turning on the display color, and it should be set to white so we can see them more clearly. If I hit play, hopefully, they'll all just fall right out of the scene because we have gravity turned on. There's soft bodies, they're just falling straight down. There's nothing to collide with. Just to be clear, especially in S22, there seems to be some sort of refresh issue that happens with certain combinations of cloners and dynamics. In this case, you see if I rewind all the way, it doesn't refresh, which it usually does. I'm hoping that gets fixed in the future. But for now, you can click 1 frame forward, 1 frame back, and it seems to jump back to normal. And hopefully, actually, it will break on me, and I can show you how to fix it. But if it does, if I don't talk about it, if it ever breaks and kind of explodes on you, at any given point, go back to the time of 0, click on your hair, and say regrow under editing, and it will just fix it. No matter how it's exploded, that will repair it. Excellent. Now, we want this to be colliding with something. What do we want to collide with? Well, the dynamic mesh here. Right-click on that one. Simulation, rigid body. Actually, undo. We could have, but instead we'll say simulation collider body. And automatically, hopefully, you see that it set your collision to static mesh. Very important, actually seeing all of the geometry here. And actually, yeah, I think that should do a good job where those will collide with it. If we once again hit play, then those should fall away. But this time you see they will actually collide with the surface here and they'll bounce off a little bit. A couple of them are intersecting. Let's not worry about that right now. But they do fall away and that's working quite nicely. So let's turn off gravity. Control or Command D. And under dynamics, click on general. We have a gravity setting. Put that down to 0. And now, with the exception of the way that they're colliding with the surface, we should be able to hit play and they'll just kind of drift away a little bit or not move at all. They are drifting away because they are technically colliding with the surface a little bit, which makes them kind of drift away. There's several different things we want to do. Currently, these splines have no thickness. And we can, by giving them thickness, we actually get a lot of control over the way that they interact with each other. So there's actually an equation that we can keep in mind for what the thickness of these should be. But where you're going to plug this number in is find your hair, the splines, under its dynamics tag. there is the collision tab, and under that we have a margin. Click on use, and we want to use the margin of that. And the margin we want to use here is going to be 5. And the reason why in this case we're using 5 is we are taking the length of the hair, which is 100, and they have 10 segments, which means there is 10 units in between every one of those segments, and there's going to be one of these margins on each side of it. So pretty much the equation ends up being take the length divided by the segments and then divide that by 2 is going to be our end guess on that one. So if I had to play right now, it should work. If I deselect, we can just see the splines nicely, hit play, and you see that they all fly away, but they're not exploding. I want to show you what it would look like if it wasn't working properly. So if we double this up to 10, we could even do as light as 6, but we should see, I'm going to frame by frame. You see how they're suddenly exploding? You can see that they start like kind of piling up on themselves, and that's because every individual point of that spline is fighting the next point on that spline. So if it's not working properly, you should be able to tell very quickly, and that means your margin is too high. You could guess it, but mathematically 5 should be the magic number here, and they're very smoothly moving away. Very nice. Next up, pretty straightforward step, but this is kind of where the magic happens, and that is under simulate, create a force, field force. This is now our new, we turn off gravity, so this is going to be the only force in the entire scene. By default, I tend to like jumping the strength up to 55. The reason why, well, it's quick to type, which is why I do it. But gravity in the scene is about 40. So if you think of 40 as, okay, that's as fast as gravity pulls things down, we're right around a little stronger than gravity, so it's kind of a good benchmark. So it's pulling it in a little bit stronger than gravity would. What should it be? What should be driving the effect here? What I'm thinking is let's drag in our low poly mesh, our dynamic mesh, into the field. And if we click on that, you will see the mode is currently set to points. I don't want points. I want to be set to the surface of the object. Now, we don't get a lot of feedback right now in the viewport because the display is only set to 200 by 200. And this text is about 200. So it's not that big of a box. So in order to see it clearly, I'm going to jump this up to 2000 by 2000. We won't see too much because it's so big that there's not enough subdivisions here. But if we crank that up way high to like 200, then now we can see that we are seeing a little bit of feedback on it. But keep in mind we have our three orientations, X, Y, Z. And I don't need a three-dimensional view of this, so I'm going to take Z and drop that down to 0. So now what we're seeing is a cross section, but the way MoText generates text is it actually pushes it backward in space. So to see this a little bit more clearly, I'm going to scoot this backward, and you see as I center it on the text, everything becomes a lot flatter looking. It just gives us a nice looking cross section of this. So this should now give us good feedback. What this is saying is there are forces that are, I think, pushing away from the individual polygons, but they're not pushing out very far away. You see the fall off on this is quite small. So inside the field force, if you have your dynamic mesher inside of it, you can see that the surface has a radius. If we start increasing that radius, you can see the effect will start going further and further and further out. I want this to be so big that it's always going to catch everything. So I'm going to jump it up to something like 2000. It's really big now. You can see it zooms way out and it's having an effect all the way out to this distance, which is very nice. Now, it also has a fall off applied to it. You can actually see that these little tick marks get smaller as they travel outward. That is due to the remapping. So if you have your volume mesher dynamic selected, move to the remapping tab, and currently we have this fall off, which is wonderful. This is exactly the kind of thing you'd want if you want to get weaker as it falls away, but I want full power. So the inner offset is going to be increased all the way to the end, and you see that it's full power no matter how far away. Keep in mind, we have intentionally shown ourselves in this two-dimensional view, but these actually project out as 2,000 units in every direction. So it should be a nice big bubble of attraction. And actually, it's not attraction right now, it's repulsion, I'm pretty sure. So I don't want to see this field force anymore. The visibility of it's not going to be adding. So I will turn off the display box, which also makes it so it doesn't have to calculate all these individual little vectors. So turn that off. And without anything else happening, let's frame forward once, frame back, so we can see the individual splines. Actually, right now you can see that they're all a little bit bent and curved, and they're changing a little bit. Once again, if it's being weird, click on your hair, click regrow, and it's going to straighten them all out again. So not changing anything else, hit play, and you see them all start flying away, but they're flying away and accelerating. So that means our field force is backwards. The surface is trying to push outward. Pretty simple to fix. Into the field force, the object tab, click on the mesher. Under that, we have the direction, and currently the direction is set to invert. I don't want to invert it, so turn that off, and now it should be attracting the object. Rewind all the way if it doesn't refresh. Once again, 1 frame forward, 1 frame back, just something we got to deal with right now. Hit play, and everything now is getting attracted to this mesh perfectly. That is looking amazing. Now that shape right now, by default, is cool. I mean, I can see uses for that. That'd be neat. So keep that type of thing in mind. But it's not conforming very well to our overall shape because the splines are soft bodies and there are settings in the soft bodies. So inside of the dynamic tag, go into soft body and you can see that there's actually a lot of flexion. I think that's our magic setting in this one. So if we were to set flexion down really low, in fact, why don't we just try setting it to 0? Rewind, frame forward, frame back, hit play. I mean, these are not quite perfect, but I'm going to ignore that until they're so broken that I need to do a full reset. Hit play. And we can see them begin running, and with 0 flexion, that means essentially we're saying, hey, don't the springs that create flexion, which are trying to keep angles straight, there's none of them. So every single part of the spline can bend however it wants to, and nothing is attempting to straighten it out. And now that that is running forward, you see all these are getting pulled in, and they have a radius of 5 units, on both sides. So 5 units from that spline and 5 units from this spline are trying not to run into each other. Everything is getting attracted to the surface. Now, currently, the number of hairs we have, there's a lot of them. So some of them can't get to the surface, but a lot of them are running right along the surface, exactly 5 units away from it, in fact. And they're not overlapping each other. So this is starting to get interesting. Now, I don't actually want the flexion to be 0. I'm not sure what number I do want. So let's try 5 and let's see if they... that's a relatively low number, but yeah, right away you can see that it's trying to maintain their curves a little bit more. They're not like bending all over the place. So, you got to find the value that works for you, that they're staying relatively straight. So we could still drop that down further and, they'll conform even more. There's a lot of options here, but I think that's actually working quite nicely. Now we're going to refine this quite a bit more, but we've got all the basics that we need right now. So what I'm thinking is let's move on to the next step, which is deforming our final geometry. So our final geometry is the deform mesher. And we could deform it with a displacer, but I've actually really been enjoying using the plane effector as a deformer. And technically that does calculate a little bit quicker. So creating a plane effector, I'm going to make it a child of the volume mesher at the very bottom. And I'm going to turn on deform. So under deformation, say deform the points. It's going to explode and look really crazy. So that's happening because under parameter, it currently is pushing out on Y, but technically forward and backward inside of Cinema in general is Z. So this is not the orientation we want. Let's zero out Y and set it to Z. Let's use a light touch. I'm going to set it to 5. Okay, you see everything inflates based on that. So everything's inflated 5 units. So working very well. In fact, why don't we give the file a save? And say 1B. And this is a good time to mention that if you support on Patreon, that you can get access to all of these scene files. Currently, this effect is getting applied everywhere on our plane deformer. But we don't want it to apply everywhere. We want it to apply within a certain range of this spline. So under the fall off of this plane, in fact, why don't we rename it plane deformer, because that's what it is. Deformer, plane deformer. Go to the fall off tab, and what do we want to control? Well, how do we want to control it? We want to control it with the hair. Drag in the hair, and right away we're going to see an effect, which is cool. But specifically, if we click on the hair, it is currently calculating by traveling along the spline, which is powerful in other places. It's not going to be too helpful for us here. What we want is a distance mode radius. So essentially it's creating a radius around every single one of these splines, and that's becoming a fall off. The radius currently is set to 10 units. Right away, we can see that every one of these splines is now represented in the surface of this object via this. So we got a plane deformer just with a fall off. We don't need to calculate the colors. That's not doing anything for us. We can change the radius to anything we like, set that down. Well, if we set it down to something small like 5, keep in mind our object is 5 units away from it, so that's not going to quite reach the surface. So setting that to 10 is enough for it to reach there. Keep in mind, we can go into the effector and have this push out further. I can increase this, and that's going to get super crazy, and it's pretty cool that we can interactively do this. And we can also go negative, and those will actually shrink inside. We can temporarily visually hide the hairs. And you see, this is pretty cool already. Look at this very sculpted, it's a weird kind of sculpted look, and this is an entirely parametric setup. Everything, we have not made anything editable yet. And look at these just amazing streaks following the curvature, very randomly, but it's following the curvature of this object. So we've got a lot of really cool potential here. Now, currently, I mean, essentially we are pretty restricted in the shape that this is returning because the splines are floating so far away from the surface. So I'm going to set this back to 5 so that it inflates a little bit. And let's see what we can do about making these splines not be quite as far away from the surface as they are. We know that these have a radius of 5, so that's how far they're pushing away. So a thought is, what if we go into the dynamic mesh and we push it in, we shrink it down about 5 units worth. So let's see if we can do that. I'm going to hide our deforming one. Let's unhide our dynamic. And inside the builder, we can create another, I'm not sure what these are called, but another kind of effector inside of it. Dilate and erode. Turn that one on. And what this one does is inflates or deflates the object. So currently it's inflating by 5, which is pretty cool. But all we have to do is say -5, and it should deflate it down. And now it's going to get, oops, I accidentally moved it, hit undo. It has now made it smaller and really skinny, but that should be exactly 5 units inward. So hopefully what that translates to is, let's hide it again and look at our final one. Let's rewind all the way, frame forward, frame back, just to do a reset. In fact, why don't we even click on the hair and just force a regrow refresh? So it's nice and smooth. Hit play, and let me deselect so it's not there. And now, actually, we'll temporarily turn off the deformer just so we can see it. Now, hopefully, let's let it settle in just a little bit. Hopefully we can see, yes, look at this spline is right on the surface of the object. Now we do have a lot of additional splines. They're floating away further because they can't quite catch up to that surface. But we now have a layer of splines that actually are laying almost directly on the surface of this thing. So what that enables us to do is when we turn on our plane deformer, everything's going to be deformed, and you can see that it's actually right there on the surface, and we're getting a lot more fidelity in the overall geometry. This also means that clicking on the plane deformer, we can go into our fall off, and currently has a radius of 10, but we can start shrinking this smaller because these are right on the surface. So shrinking it down to 5, you can now see those are pinched in a lot nicer. I'm not sure how far we can go. Eventually it probably will get a little bit too small. It's not going to, quite have perfect fidelity on it, but a radius of 3 is actually looking pretty good. You know what? I feel like we can throw a little bit more geometry at this. If I hit NB, you can see our subdivisions. So let's increase this and click on the volume that is our final mesh, the one that's getting deformed, and actually click on the volume builder. And let's drop the voxel size to 1.5, or just whatever is smaller. That should actually, that dramatically increase it. We can also drop it to 1. I think that might be a happy medium for right now. But yeah, looking very nice there. Let's go ahead and just play around a little bit and tweak a couple of settings. Currently, the radius on these is set to 5, but let's remember that kind of equation we did. Something we might be able to do is double the number of points. So there's twice as many points being generated along here, but if we double the number of points, we have to cut the distance in half. So back inside of the dynamics tag, under collision, our margin is 5, set to 2.5. So we've doubled the resolution of everything. So that means they should be able to get closer together, but also get closer to the surface. And that means we can fit more hairs onto the surface. But we have a lot of hairs right now. I think we can cut back on them. So we currently have a count of 55. I'm going to drop it down. I'm just guessing. I'm going to drop it down to about 30. So we have 30 different hairs. Click regrow. And they're actually already there on the surface very well. There's not that many of them, but let's see what this does. Hit play. And hopefully, let's see. Actually, it doesn't seem to be refreshing there very well. So I might regrow again. Regrow. Deselect, just so we can see it better. There we go. So yeah, whenever, like I said, whenever you have problems, go ahead and click on hair and click regrow, and that's probably going to fix it for you. I think I need more. I shouldn't have gotten rid of quite so many hairs because you see now that there's enough room for them to all squeeze in. But having said that, look at this amazing layout where we have these different splines wrapping around this randomly, not intersecting each other, pushing each other out of the way. So that is working wonderfully. I love it. I'm going to save it. More hairs are needed, so clicking on hair, we can increase the count by quite a bit. I might jump this up to something like 100 and regrow. The field force is working well. This should be pulling everything in. We've got the new spacing going with the increased count. So if we hit play, we should see this start to, actually, no, the hairs aren't quite working there. So I'm going to regrow them again, deselect, hit play. There you go. Like I said, whenever it's not quite working, make sure you hit regrow. These all get pulled inside the surface. You see we're getting, I mean, it's not amazing playback, but we're getting enough playback here. We can see it pretty well. And these are filling in the space pretty nicely. There's almost, I think, the exact amount that we need to cover the overall surface of this. It's looking pretty nice. Now, what I'm thinking is let's get some extra variation in here by creating some turbulence, because right now they're just going to settle into their final location. But if we want this to stay alive, we can create a simulation forces turbulence. Now, we could do this several different ways. We could add a random inside the field force. I kind of like the turbulence being separate. It just seems like a clean workflow to keep it separate like this. But, you know, several different ways of doing everything in Cinema, of course. This turbulence, I will set the strength to 22, give it a little bit of scale. Keep in mind that our overall object is about 200 tall, and I think you can think of these kind of like units. So this is about 50 units, so the noise would probably be about that size. And I want to see a little bit of individual flow and movement all over the place. It might be animating a little bit quick, so I'll pull the frequency back a little bit, not too much. And on top of that, I want these to slide around quite freely. So currently, the dynamic mesh is got a lot of friction and a lot of bounce. But if we just go into the hair and change its properties, so no bounce, and let's go very easy on the friction. I'm going to say 5% on the friction. They can very freely slide past each other and very freely slide around the surface. Now, I think we probably will need a few extra hairs here because if it's sliding around, it might leave some gaps behind. So we'll jump it up to, let's not go too far. Let's say 120. Rewind all the way, click regrow, and you know what? Let's send this to the picture viewer so we can see it play back in real time. So Control or Command B, pop open our render settings, set this to the awesome viewport renderer, output to, let's say, Instagram resolution 1080, lock the ratio just to go quicker. I'll set that down to 50%, turn that in half, change the frame range to all frames. And I don't need to save it. And that should be everything we need for that. Actually, one last thing we do, click on the viewport renderer. And I'm going to say load a preset. I'm going to load one of my presets, which is just kind of like what you see in the viewport here. We can also go to the basic tab and say copy effects from viewport. And those should match pretty well. I don't want to see these hairs in the preview. So we'll do something like that. Frame up just a little bit better here. And send this off to the picture viewer and see what kind of results we get. That took about 3 minutes to run. Let's see what the end result here is in real time. Very nice. I could probably make the turbulence a little bit stronger and maybe even kill off the friction entirely. But you see how this is staying alive now based on the way that these are moving along the surface. So there's so much fun and so much potential in this technique overall. We could keep on making little tweaks on this and having fun, but this is honestly the core of the idea of this technique, and there's so many possibilities. You know, of course, you could change the material in here and make it look like some sort of weird brain. This actually started as a completely unrelated question, but just like while we play with this in real time, hit play. Well, not real time, but you know, right in the viewport, hit play, and we can see the effect move in. But because we're seeing this so cleanly, so nicely here in the viewport, I just want to let it settle in a little bit so we can see the individual lines more. We can adjust exactly what the effect should look like at any given point. So right there, it's a pretty good frame. So using the plane deformer, we could say that this should not be pushing quite as far. So this could be calmed down a lot. It could be pushing pretty far and then go into the fall off. And currently the radius is set to 3, but if we set that smaller, it's going to start putting smaller individual lines here. Letting it run a little bit more could be a good idea to let them settle in, but these lines are starting to get maybe a little bit far off from the surface, so we might need those closer in. So you can start seeing some of the individual lines popping out more. So controlling this radius at any given point is going to have a dramatic effect on the overall look. But keep in mind, we've also got our plane deformer, and under parameter, we could change this. This could be pushing out really far, which can start looking super crazy. But drag this negative, and we can get an inverted effect. Pushed it too far. Let's say -5 instead of +5. And these will push inward, grabbing the fall off and increasing this even further. They'll start blending in, but the overall shape will shrink more. Just the basic combinations of this could be absolutely insane, really fun. We got the entire overall mesh. There are so many additional ways of playing with this, and that is why there's going to be a link right here to jump to a part 2 of this, because I think there's so much more exploration to do. Be sure to check out the second part of this tutorial, because as I said, there's so much exploration. I've got a bunch of really cool techniques that could be added to this, but this is an experiment in trying to make a slightly shorter tutorial, make it so that here's the core of the technique, and if you know what you're doing, you'll be like, okay, I can see lots of possibilities. I'm going to go make this my own, and go ahead and change it and make it and do really cool things, motion graphics pieces, anything. Like I said, if you make anything cool from this, please at me. I would love to see the end result of this. If you like this content, if you want to support what I'm doing, if this was useful to you and you end up using it in a job, I have a Patreon set up. It'd be great if you could pitch in there and support, but these tutorials and the live streams will always be free, so that support is appreciated but not needed. But with that wrapped up, I'll see you in part 2. Bye-bye. The Motex is set to a chunkier font. I just like them to be a little bit thicker. That's phrasing.